point of time. Let's take a pause in sports and head straight at this point of time to listen into Arvind Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor.
Senior colleagues in the Ministry of Finance, the Honourable Minister of State, Jayant Sinha, the Finance Secretary, Ratan Watal, Economic Affairs Secretary, Shakti Kanta Das, the Revenue Secretary, Hasmukh Adhia, Anjali Duggal, and Neeraj Mathur. All of them have been great colleagues to work with. Also want to thank profusely all my senior colleagues who are sitting here. They've done a great job in making this happen. Of course, there are many other people who work in the economic division as well. Some of them are seated here on the right. Thank you all very much. I think one of the principles of this survey is certainly that ideas matter, and they matter no matter where they come from. So I want to take this time to thank in particular two outsiders who are not part of the government, who contributed to it. Professor Devesh Kapoor at the University of Pennsylvania, and my good friend and old IMF colleague Josh Feldman, who's here as well. Of course, the members of my team who are all sitting here. I can't name them all, but they've been really critical and part of this effort. The office of CEA, my office that keeps me in good shape, Srinivasan, Aniket, Preman, Jyot Singh, all these people are here. Many thanks are owed to them as well. I'm not doing this out of any bureaucratic or hierarchical compulsion. I want to thank profusely my great boss, the Honourable Finance Minister Arun Jaitley. He doesn't expect to be thanked, so this is not. But I think he has to be. I want to thank him both for the support, the real support, and the space that he supported for such an ambitious enterprise to even be attempted. Of course, tomorrow morning, after all your reactions, he may regret having given me this, indulged me in this manner. But profound gratitude to him as well. Last point, prefatory point, is that I think that with an enterprise such as this, it's highly likely that we've actually tread on many toes. But hopefully this has been done without any bad intent, malintent. And hopefully also we've been pretty non-discriminatory in making enemies. As they say, it's better to make many enemies than a few enemies. But I will say that in some ways, if we haven't tread on toes, I think we've actually not done a good job, because I think in the end, the survey is about producing, challenging analysis and ideas. There's a great line by John Maynard Keynes who said that, words ought to be a little wild, because they are the assault of thoughts on the unthinking. I mean, I'm not saying any of you are unthinking, but I think that, that's the spirit in which this survey has been done. So with those prefatory remarks, thank you to everyone who's contributed. Let's proceed to the survey. Let me give you a quick overview. I'm going to describe the contents, then going to be 4 parts to this: the macroeconomy and current prospects. And then 2 big themes of the survey are, structural reforms to facilitate exit. So exit and the lack of it is going to be one big theme of the survey. And the other big theme is, how can the state be strengthened by kind of improving its fiscal relations with both the poor and the rich. So these are the 2 kind of broad themes of the survey. And then, I'm going to conclude with hopefully an upbeat but candid assessment of where we stand in India today. As I said last year, we have 2 volumes to the survey. Volume 1 is analytical, forward-looking, and prescriptive. And this year it has much more of a medium-term focus than last year. But it very much builds upon the fantastic work that's gone into Volume 2, which summarizes recent developments and outlines very clearly where we stand today and where we've come in the last 1 year. It has 9 chapters. Volume 1, as I said, is split into 3, the macro and current situation, structural reform and exit. And, this is a one-liner that I hope keep tweeting and retweeting. The thought here is that, the Indian economy has moved from socialism with restricted entry to marketism without exit. and how the government is actually acting upon this situation is going to be one of the themes of Volume 1. And under that, there are 6 chapters. And as I said, strengthening the state has 4 chapters, and it's going to be one of the themes of the survey as well. Okay, now, first, the macro outlook and policy. And this is something I know you're all going to be very interested in. So let me summarize it for you before I elaborate on each of this. Point number 1, I think the world economy is becoming increasingly grim. I don't know whether I should crack this joke or not, but I might as well, it's like saying, the world economy is like a fairy tale, grim. And so that's what the world economy is like. That means that 3 things I think 3 consequences follow from that. We must recalibrate expectations about India's performance, and I'll explain why that's the case. We must, in this uncertain environment, sustain macroeconomic stability. We must also, in this environment, because there are such deflationary risks in the economy, monetary and fiscal policy must also purchase insurance against this growth slowdown. And finally, I think, the one way to think about some of the pressing challenges in the Indian economy is that we no longer have a twin deficit problem, the fiscal and the current account deficit, which was a big problem in 2013. We have a twin balance sheet challenge, and I'm going to explain that in some detail later. Now, the world economy is becoming grim. I can't think of any other moment in history or in the last 25, 30 years when there's such a unique cocktail of, pervasive vulnerabilities around the world. In the advanced economy, growth is faltering, and that's reflected in, stock prices are plummeting in the major advanced economies. China's growth outlook looks, pretty challenging. Some other emerging economies are also, in difficulty, Brazil and Russia. And of course, all the oil exporting economy, including the big ones like are under considerable stress. So this cocktail can come together. And so one of the things we do in the survey is to say that perhaps this cocktail could lead to an extreme event. This is not a high probability event, but it's certainly an event which could have a crisis, and this crisis could actually be very unique. It's the first crisis possibly after World War II that could resemble the events of the Great Depression in the 1930s, a series of deflationary competitive devaluations that spread across the globe like a kind of deflationary gravitational wave, to use a recent analogy. It's not a high probability event, but it's something that cannot be discounted, and that's something that India must prepare for over the next year or so. Now, and we have a table here explaining, what kind of form this next crisis might take. If that's the case, then we in India and the world must recalibrate its expectations, because India has become so entwined with the world. It's a cliche, but it's very true that increasingly India has become integrated. And this is a chart that shows how correlated Indian growth and world growth have become. The correlation is about 0.42 in the last 10 years. And this means that if the world slows down, we will slow down as well. And so, slowing down should not be blamed on what India does or does not do. And so it's really important to calibrate in expectations. And this is, this has been more and more true in the last few years. So, outlook for growth and inflation. Let me just make this clear. There was a typo in the survey and in some of the tweets. So our real GDP growth projection for the coming fiscal year, 2016-17, is 7 to 7.75%. And there's a wide range which reflects the fact, that the range of exogenous possibilities is also very wide, from a rebound in agriculture, which means we'll be at the upper end of that range, and a full-fledged international crisis, which could take us to the lower end or even below that. And also this uncertainty that's been created by the divergence between the nominal and real growth aggregates, which we're still, fully playing itself out. The inflation projection, it's going to be between 4.5% to 5%, below the RBI's target, and we explain why that's the case. The 7th Pay Commission, to the extent we're going to decide on the implementation in the budget. going to have a minimal effect. There's rising excess capacity. The private sector is stressed. There's a deflationary world environment, and therefore this is the risks are all to the downside. That's why the 4.5% to 5%. Now, what are the major risks to this scenario? Mostly global, faltering world growth, perhaps even a financial event extreme, and rising oil prices. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that if you get faltering world growth and extreme financial events, it's likely that oil prices will decline. So that's some compensating consolation for India. If growth slows down, oil prices are also down, and therefore there's a kind of balance. However, there is a scenario, which is, I think, the worst case scenario, where because of supply disruptions, oil prices could go up and world growth could decline, which would be the worst case scenario from an Indian point of view. Okay. So having said that, let me run through, monetary fiscal policy going ahead. One of the interesting things to us is that, and this is something that's been commented upon, that declines in the policy rate have not been transmitted into bank lending and deposit rates. Why is that the case? And it's interesting that it's not that it's happened at all, but certainly after the last rate cut in October, this has not happened. Pass-through did happen to a greater extent before the October rate cut, but it did not after the October rate cut. If you look at the numbers, the total policy cut has been 125 basis points, but the deposit rates have come down only 93, and the base lending rate by 63. And so the question is, why is that the case? Perhaps small savings, and the government is working on that, but the small savings rate cannot explain why there's a change before the October and after the rate cut. Our analysis shows that perhaps what's happened after the October rate cut is that liquidity has been unusually tightened, so that what this chart shows is the wedge between the policy rate and the 91-day T-bill rate, which is a measure of how tight liquidity is. Notice that after the previous rate cut in June, that differential comes down, but after the October rate cut, in fact, the T-bill rate, the difference between the T-bill rate and the policy rate goes up enormously. And we have other evidence to show that, this is something that... So the conclusion that follows from this, two conclusions for monetary policy. One is that there is scope for easing monetary policy in two ways. One, to bring, to inject liquidity, to bring it in line even with the current policy rate. And the second is that, given our inflation projection and our assessment going, perhaps there's more scope for easing the policy rate as well. Now, it's a slide that all of you are waiting for. Fiscal. Remember, the big debate is that, not whether to loosen or tighten fiscal policy, but the debate has been whether to consolidate aggressively or more gradually. That's been the big debate. And the objectives are clear for everyone. Everyone in government shares this objective. Fiscal policy must balance maintaining stability by debt and deficits declining, but at the same time purchasing insurance against a growth slowdown. Now, I'll be very honest with you. We've had a very, very lively and rich debate within government on this question. You all know where everyone stood on this question. I think it's tremendous credit to the government for having allowed the space debate to happen, because the arguments are very good on both sides. We've spelled out what the pros and cons are, and very compelling arguments. I'm sure we will take it up in the discussion. So at the end of all this, the government decided in the budget to reduce or increase the fiscal deficit by... Sorry, I can't reveal that, obviously, and you'll have to wait until Monday to get the answer to that question. As I said, we've moved from a twin deficit to a twin balance sheet problem. And the twin balance sheets, of course, are those of the public sector banks and the large corporate houses on the right. Essentially that, there are lots of stressed assets in banks, and at the same time, the profitability and indebtedness of some of the corporates is kind of deteriorating or is not very healthy. And so this is going to be the big challenge going forward. How do you, address this twin balance sheet challenge? Now, in the survey, we say that what needs to happen to address this problem is what we call the 4 R's. Recognition, which is what the RBI is trying to do. We must come clean on these bad assets. 2, recapitalization, that is, once you identify the problem, you've got to put money into it. And the Indradhanush scheme started on that. And the government is committed to recapitalizing the banks. 3, it's a point that's less well understood. Resolution. Remember, double accounting. Stressed assets on the public sector banks is a liability of the corporates. There are twin images of the same thing. So we can't really the public sector part of it, the bank part of it, unless the underlying asset which has given rise to that bad or stressed debt is also addressed. And these are generally in infrastructure and steel and power, and those need to be addressed as well. And of course, the 4th R, we need reform, because we need to ensure that whatever we do on the 3 Rs has to be backed up with reform to ensure that this does not happen again. So the 4 Rs are key. Government is working on them. But I do want to say that the 2nd R, money, resources, very critical. And one of the ideas we throw out in the survey is perhaps, can we find these resources in the public sector balance sheet? And one of those public sector balance sheets is, of course, the RBI. And there's an interesting chart here which shows how equity, it compares equity, government equity in the RBI as a share of its total assets with equity in other major central banks. That the Indian government has a lot of equity in this, so the question is whether this can also contribute to the recapitalization and part of the 4 Rs package of this. So that's the macro, and we'll come back to this no doubt in the questions. Now let me run through the other parts. Of the survey, structural reforms viewed through the lens of exit. Of course, we all know the Chakravyuha legend. You get in, but you can't get out, with lots of adverse consequences. And we call this socialism with limited entry to marketism without exit. I think what has been really striking for all of us writing this chapter is that impeded exit, the fact that exit cannot happen, is pervasive in India. It's not just in the public sector. It's in the public sector. It's in the private sector. It's sector-specific, wide. It's in manufacturing. It's in agriculture. It's pervasive. It's very costly, but it's also fixable. And there's a table there, and the chapter explains where all this problem exists and what the costs are. The one point I want to just highlight here is that, remember, the twin balance sheet problem is a classic contemporary manifestation of that exit problem. We're not able to exit out of some of these assets on the corporate side and some of these loans on the bank side. Why does exit happen? I think we call this the 3 Is: interests, institutions, and ideology. The one that I want to focus on is institutions, that many associate developing countries like India with weak institutions. But the interesting thing in India is that this exit problem, especially with the NPA and corporate problem, arises from a combination, a kind of almost a perverse combination of weak and strong institutions. We have weak institutions because willful defaulters perhaps cannot be published. There's a lot of delays in the DRT system and so on. But we also have very strong referee institutions, which kind of creates a bureaucratic paralysis, difficulties of decision-making, because bureaucrats are fearful that referee institutions will kind of go after them. So it's this, a strange combination of weak and strong institutions. I think that really is very interesting, needs to be resolved. And of course, the reforms that the government is doing to address this problem include, the bankruptcy law, which I think will have a big impact on this. Actually settling cases like Dabol, which kind of really sorts out this whole 4R problem. The Indradhanush, of course, is also about recapitalizing the banks and getting one part of it right. And steps in the power sector, address some of the problems on the corporate side. So I think this exit as a theme, that, Rajaji said that, we were a license quota, entry quota permit Raj, but he had in mind, I think, the entry side. I don't think he ever imagined that we could have similar problems on the exit side. And that's something, and you will see that throughout the survey, this problem afflicts many, many other sectors as well. Okay, take agriculture, for example. I think that many things can be said about it, but of course, we know that after 4 successive seasons of weak rainfall, agriculture is increasingly demanding attention, which of course the budget will focus on to a great extent. And there are many, many things that need to be done in agriculture, and you can write hundreds of books on this. But there is a kind of exit perspective as well, which I want to highlight. Essentially that in some ways Indian agriculture has been very successful in some respects, in cereals. So we've had a cereal-centric, regionally concentrated and input-intensive set of agricultural policies. And essentially what I think conceptually needs to happen is to exit from that or move away from that, or in addition to that, to developing other crops like pulses and oil seeds, to make this more regionally broad, to not use inputs intensively, and what the Prime Minister has said, more crop per drop, which is, get more for less from inputs, especially from water, and also to get better prices for farmers. In fact, if you look at the survey, we show how large the wedges are between, farm gate prices and retail prices, and in the process, the farmer is losing out. Hence, the APMC endeavor of the government is actually going to be very, very important. Similarly, on trade policy and free trade agreements, a big question is, all these mega regional agreements are being negotiated, the 2 big ones being TPP, which has actually been, and TTIP, which is being, and if you look at the numbers in terms of what share of world GDP and trade they cover, they're enormous, and we are going to be kind of left out of that. And so we have some big challenges. And there's a chapter on free trade agreements where we actually quantify what the impact of India's free trade agreements have been. And we find that broadly, the impact is exactly as you would expect. If you cut tariffs, we import more. If partners cut tariffs, we export more. And it turns out that because we cut tariffs more, our imports have increased more than exports. And they've increased especially from ASEAN FTAs and especially in minerals and metals, especially metals. And on the export side, we've had some gains in textiles and clothing, especially clothing. And so it's panned out exactly. So we need to use this analysis to inform this decision about how we deal with these mega trade agreements. Now, exit. We have a chapter on fertilizer, especially urea. And, again, important reforms have been undertaken, neem coating, which is going to prevent diversion. There's been gas pooling, which addresses the kind of producer side of it. But we still think that, more reforms can be done. I think the fertilizer subsidy is pretty big, 75,000 crores, excluding arrears. It has multiple regulations. And what we show in the survey is that actually the urea market, because of these multiple regulations, has a huge black market, which actually ends up hurting the small farmer. This chart shows, for example, that 80%, this is in 2012-13, I mean, things may have changed now, but the last available data on which we did this analysis, 80% of small farmers buy urea at prices greater than the administered price, and pay 50% more. So it really does end up hurting the small farmer. And of the total urea subsidy of about 50,000, only 35% goes to the small farmer, and in between there are 3 sources, to inefficient firms outside the country, industrial users, large farmer. So essentially, in a sense, the targeting of this subsidy ends up being less good than it should be. So the policy package that we recommend there is, liberalizing imports of urea so that the farmer has more access to it. And also, it's a very ripe for implementing, the JAM initiative, which we spoke about last survey as well. Power, again, under a very dynamic minister, we have had a number of very positive developments, which have been tweeted, I'm told. Record generation increase in capacity, major push on renewables, tantalizing moves to make India one market in power, to create one price in power. But I think all these have set the stage for, I would say, the next generation of reforms. And we highlight many of them in this chapter. But here I just want to mention 2. So this is a typical tariff schedule from a state. We won't tell you which state it is. And the simple question that we ask ourselves is that if there's one price for petroleum, why are there 100 prices for power? There is a separate tariff for mushroom and rabbit farms. There is a separate power tariff for municipalities and one for municipal corporations. And, there must be some difference here, which, it goes on and on. So I think, simplification of tariff schedules, I think, could be an easy, low-hanging fruit that we could capture. A second reform that we emphasize, of course, is that, it's amazing if you think of India like a trade economist would about the power sector. You find there are, in fact, quote-unquote, many both price and non-price barriers to, for power moving across states. And this chart shows, for example, that, the Tamil Nadu, the cross-subsidy surcharge that it imposes, i.e. for any firm in Tamil Nadu to buy from another state, the effective, tariff, and here I'm not saying power tariff, but as in a trade tariff, is somewhere between 50 and 100%. Far away from one market in power, and I think that's something that could be the next stage of reform in power. There are many structural changes in the. I think everyone recognizes that India's big challenge is to create good jobs, safe, productive, high-paying, dignified jobs. These tend to be in the formal sector. So the challenge is as much about creating formal sector jobs as it is about jobs in general. And here what we show in the chapter is that there's some very interesting developments taking place in India. I'm not being normative here at all. There's increasing contractualization of labor on a major scale. There's a kind of competitive federalism dynamic where some big firms are coming, labor laws are changing, and that's creating a dynamic of competition between states. And the other surprising phenomenon was, a lot of firms, especially in the labor-intensive apparel sector, are shifting, relocating to second-tier towns and cities, which can have enormous externalities in terms of, bringing more women into the labor force, because apparel tends to be very women-intensive in employment. We also have a section showing that, the mandatory deductions from employees' salaries seem to be quite high for the poor, very small for the rich. So this is one of those, strange inversions that happen in India. And here's something that I think the center could work on more profitably. I'm going to take another 5 minutes, so be with me. So the last part of the survey is strengthening the state. So one big question, there was even an article the other day, and Thomas Piketty was here and said, India undertaxes, India underspends, the government should spend and tax more. And then if you actually look at it carefully, what you find is something very interesting but somewhat. If you just look at India's tax to GDP and expenditure to GDP and compare it with other countries like, Brazil or Korea or Vietnam or emerging market economies, it does turn out that we do spend less. But that's not the right comparison. The right comparison is, if you control for the fact that India is a poor country and a democracy, and actually a relatively young democracy, it turns out that India is not, at least in money terms, in resources terms, is not an undertaxing, underspending economy at all. In fact, if you compare the history of tax in India with say, the United States, in the United States, actually tax to GDP ratios and in the income tax came into play because of major upheavals like 2 wars and the Great Depression. And India, actually, from a historical point of view, is not doing too badly. So I wouldn't buy necessarily the argument that India undertaxes and underspends from a money point of view. But what is striking is that in terms of the number of taxpayers, in individual income taxpayers, we do seem to be an outlier. And our kind of rough, crude estimates suggest that, the ratio of taxpayers to voters in India is 4%. And we kind of crudely estimate that it should be something like 23%. For a country at its level of economic development. There are some solutions, like, for example, on the right-hand side, you see the top chart is exemption limits. They've been rising very steadily, much faster than, per capita GDP has been growing. So one low-hanging fruit is, just not to increase exemption limits and allow natural increases in income of those to come into the tax net, and that's a way for increasing the number of taxpayers. I think the deeper point about the chapter tries to make is that if you want India to increase taxation and spending, which the government needs to build, physical infrastructure, human infrastructure, and all those very important and vital things, that the state has to become more legitimate in some sense. It has to deliver goods that everyone recognizes as important and deliver them effectively. I think it also needs
bounties for the well-off, and maybe to start thinking about taxing everyone, regardless of the source of income. And we have this, we've got some recent data to see how, in fact, income distribution is doing at the very top. This is something that Thomas Piketty, when we were together, he was been complaining that India doesn't provide the tax data, but now soon we're going to do so, and we have some early tax data available. And what you find is that actually between 2000 and 2012-13, India, like in other countries, the top 1%, their share of total income increased quite a bit. And now we're like the UK in terms of concentration of income at the very top, but not as bad as the United States. But this is something that I think it's quite an interesting fact about India that I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in kind of pursuing this line of research. Now, I think something that I've seen retweeted quite a lot also is that, when we speak about subsidies in India, we always tend to think about the food subsidy, the kerosene subsidy, the fertilizer subsidy. But it turns out that we also are very generous to the well-off. In this chapter, for example, we analyze 7 areas where the well-off are subsidized, and these are listed here. And it turns out just from these 7 policies or schemes, we provide 1 lakh crore in kind of bounties to the very well-off. So this is a question that I think needs to be addressed at some point in time. And another point that we discovered to our great surprise was, when you think about who pays taxes in India and therefore who benefits from the tax exemptions, in most advanced countries, the beneficiaries of tax exemptions would be people somewhere from the middle class to the rich. But in India, the people who benefit from tax exemptions are not the middle class, are not the rich, they are the mega rich. Because the 10% tax bracket, the lowest tax bracket, starts at the top 5.8 percentile of income distribution. The 30% tax bracket, only 0.5% of all Indians, earning Indians are in that tax bracket. So when we think about tax exemptions and tax benefits in India, please keep this in mind that, we're not talking middle class, but we're talking very, very, very rich. So if this is, a bad way of spending money, there are good ways of spending money in India. And I think one of the things, one of the surveys shows, there's a chapter called Mother and Child. And essentially what we show in this chapter that, if you think about the demographic dividend, the worker 15, 20 years down the road is actually either today's child or today's fetus. And it turns out that if you can intervene at this stage of a child's life, either through the mother or through early life interventions, the returns are enormous. This graph shows, for example, on the horizontal axis you have the age of child, and 0, of course, is the time of birth, that interventions, and on the vertical axis is returns, and you find a very strong negative relationship. So the earlier you intervene, the much more that you can get out of it. And so, the policy conclusion, of course, is that it pays off to invest in early mother and child related issues. And some of these could include, providing nutrition to pregnant mothers. We also have some new findings on open defecation. And that's why I think the Swachh Bharat mission is so important. And there are many other interventions like that, providing iodized salt, for example, that have very high returns. And I think we should explore these more carefully. And also, of course, we should think about many of these, many of these interventions run up against entrenched social norms and customs. And so the kind of innovative thinking we need to do going forward is how do we, in fact, change these social norms and behaviors to make these interventions more effective. Last year, if you remember, the survey spoke about the JAM, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile agenda. We've made tremendous progress in the last 1 year in terms of the constituent elements of, the financial accounts, the mobile penetration, and the Aadhaar enrollment. And this chart shows, for example, how rapidly, we've created 3 and 5 lakh accounts in Jan Dhan and Aadhaar per day. In 2015 alone. So this is going to be the kind of infrastructure for JAM. We also show that, the LPG, the PEHL experiment, has been extremely successful, and we have a fairly rigorous estimate of this, which was about a 24% fiscal savings of that. And it turned out that it did not exclude the poor mostly. So it's been savings that are, have arisen by eliminating ghost beneficiaries and by deduplication. So this is the success that we need to build on in implementing JAM going forward. And how do we do that? Where are the next areas to JAM? So we've prepared indices of how prepared the different states are for implementing different kinds of JAMs, in the urban area and the rural areas. There's a lot of diversity within India. It turns out, of course, that in implementing rural JAM in rural areas, there are many more challenges, and we're further behind because financial connectivity is still quite poor. The business correspondent network, mobile banking are not yet up to strength, and we have to focus on that. And in terms of the next areas to prioritize for JAM, we think that fertilizer, especially P&K to begin with, and government programs like NREGA are really, low-hanging fruit because these are sectors which are controlled by the central government. In many of the other areas, a lot of the implementation has to be done in cooperation with the states. So I think that this is a very promising and a very exciting agenda on which I think major strides have been made in the last 1 year. Now, I've taken up a lot of your time. Let me conclude. So last year's survey said, look, there were these high expectations about big bang reforms in India. So last year's survey said that robust, even raucous, decentralized democracies like India and democracies that are outside of crises tend to undertake incremental reforms. And so we try to caution against unrealistic expectations. So against that standard, how have we done this year? And I think it's fair to say that we've had a number of achievements which are, there are too many to list. They're listed in Chapter 1, corruption, reducing interference in regulatory decisions, kind of wholehearted embrace of FDI, a kind of really zealous, I would say, effort to ease the cost of doing business, the public investment program, crop insurance, JAM, the power things. Lots of things have happened. And, one assessment would be that these are all individually incremental, but collectively meaningful. And so I think that's one way of characterizing the rich set of actions that have been taken in the last 1 year. But, let's also be honest and candid. There have been some disappointments, and there's still things that have, there is a kind of unfinished agenda even carried over from last year. And to give you 4 examples, I think the GST is one, strategic disinvestments are another, the twin balance sheet and subsidy rationalization are still a work in progress. And so I think this is part of what I think some would argue needs to be pushed more rapidly. And so I think that as long as these are retrievable setbacks or retrievable, non-finished business, I think there is still reason to be quite hopeful about it. And I think I will end by saying that, there is still the promise of India in terms of the economy. And I think of this promise as, comprising 3 elements. If you can combine more accelerated structural reforms at the center, especially, many of these unfinished agenda items, if we can harness the dynamic of competitive federalism at the states, and I gave you some examples of that's happening, power, labor, even in JAM implementation. And if you take account of the fact that in India increasingly, so accelerated reforms at the center, competitive federalism at the states, and good economics becoming good politics all over the country, if you combine these 3, I think there is still the real promise that India will, has a very bright future, a future that can help realize its potential GDP growth, which we show in the survey is about 8 to 10%. So if there's one line I would like to conclude with this, I would like to say that, an overall assessment would be something like this. For now, but not indefinitely, the sweet spot created by a strong political mandate, but recalibrated to account for a grimmer external environment, that sweet spot is still beckoningly there for India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for that comprehensive and focused presentation. Now we'll take a few questions.
Arvind Subramanian, live visuals. Arvind Subramanian, currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, in fact, explaining comprehensively the main postulates of the economic survey that was presented by Honorable Finance Minister in Lok Sabha this morning. Just to quickly recapitulate the main points reiterated by CEA, he said that in fact, he explained how the overall positive picture as far as India's success story in various parameters is concerned, how that has happened vis-a-vis various parameters like socio-economic, industrial, infrastructure, etc. He said that how Indian economy, in fact, he went on explaining it that how Indian economy is actually on an upswing amidst the global volatility and uncertainty in the economic environment, the international economic environment. He also explained, in fact, in detail how government signature campaigns like Make in India, Skill India, Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar, etc. and other reforms and norms that have been introduced in the last 1 year have added positively and gone in a long way in terms of adding much more substance to the country's growth trajectory. Mr. Subramanian also, in fact, enumerated various achievements by the NDA government, crop insurance scheme, ease of doing business, etc. How all these schemes have collectively added meaningfully to the robust and accelerated economic activity. He also did sum up by talking about, and I quote him, unfinished agenda of the Government of India, including GST. He said that in certain areas the work is still in progress, but all that is certainly seeing forward movement as far as the implementation of those policy reforms that have been introduced is concerned. And with that, we wrap it up here, but we, of course, will be getting you the main points of that presentation, the comprehensive and detailed presentation made by Arvind Subramanian a short while back, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Will be getting you the highlights and the high points of that in our bulletin as well.